The dim, flickering light overhead cast jagged shadows across the damp concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse, where the air reeked of rust, sweat, and something fouler that lingered beneath the surface. An aroma of long-forgotten suffering soaked into the very walls. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the cavernous space, punctuated only by the sharp, deliberate tearing of duct tape as Officer Brent Breaker Carson methodically secured his latest captive to the cold steel chair in the center of the room. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his thick fingers pressing the adhesive strips tightly against her wrists and torso, ensuring there was no give, no room for movement, no possibility of escape. The woman in the chair, Lauren Kane, sat motionless, her dark eyes locked onto him with an unsettling stillness that unsettled even him, a man who had spent years honing his ability to instill fear in others. She wasn't pleading, wasn't crying, wasn't struggling against the restraints like the others had. That was what bothered him. He had expected resistance, expected her to flinch, expected her to scream for help that would never come. Instead, she was just watching, her breath slow and measured, her jaw clenched but betraying nothing, no hint of panic or desperation. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. The others, they had understood what was happening to them by now. They had realized their fate, had broken down beneath the weight of their fear, had understood that the rules of the outside world no longer applied in here, that there was no law, no badge that could protect them from what he had planned. But this one was different. It annoyed him. Carson stepped back, exhaling heavily as he rolled his shoulders and flexed his fingers, his thick knuckles cracking from the tension that had been building in them since the moment he first laid eyes on her. She wasn't supposed to be here. He had been following someone else, another target, a simple job that had turned into something unexpected when she had appeared out of nowhere, trailing after him with that calculating gaze, that sharp awareness that made his skin crawl. She had been watching him, studying him, and when he'd confronted her, she hadn't backed down. That was her mistake. That was when he knew he had to bring her here, had to show her what happened to people who thought they could step into his world without consequence. He smirked, running a hand over the rough stubble on his jaw as he stepped closer, crouching in front of her, his boots scraping against the concrete. He could feel the heat of her breath, steady and unfaltering, as she remained utterly still, her gaze never wavering from his. He leaned in, close enough that she could smell the bitter mix of coffee and tobacco on his breath. "You're a quiet one," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice that had sent shivers down the spines of men much tougher than her. Most people, they like to ask questions, they like to beg, but not you. Lauren didn't respond, didn't blink. Carson chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "See, I don't like that. I don't like when people act like they're in control when they're not. Because I control this, sweetheart. You don't get a say in what happens next." Still, nothing. Not even a flicker of fear in her expression. That pissed him off. He reached out, gripping her jaw roughly, tilting her face upward so he could look into her eyes, his fingers pressing into her skin just hard enough to bruise. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice sharpening. Lauren exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, before finally speaking. "You think this is control?" Carson's fingers twitched against her jaw, irritation flashing across his face. "You don't even realize what you've done," she continued, her voice quiet but firm, lacking the tremble he had expected. "You don't even understand who you've brought here." He narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening as he searched her expression for any sign of deception, but all he found was certainty, unwavering, unshaken. It was a look he had seen before, but never on someone tied to that chair. He had seen it in men who thought they could take him down. Men who had underestimated what he was capable of, and yet For the first time in his life, something inside him whispered that maybe this time, maybe just this once, it was he who had miscalculated. But no, that was impossible. He let out a slow exhale, releasing her jaw with a sharp jerk of his hand before standing back to his full height, looming over her. His pulse was steady, his mind clear. He had done this before. He knew how this played out. "You think you're special," he muttered, shaking his head. "You think you're different." She just watched him, silent. He smirked, turning away as he reached for the nearby table, where a collection of tools lay scattered across its surface. He ran his fingers over the cold metal of a crowbar, the smooth handle of a hunting knife, the familiar weight of his baton. He didn't need weapons to make his point, but they certainly helped. "I've broken better people than you," he said, as he picked up the baton, testing its balance in his palm. "I don't care who you think you are. By the time I'm done with you, you'll know exactly where you stand." For the first time, Lauren moved. A slow tilt of her head, a small shift in her posture. It was subtle, but he noticed. She smiled. Calm. Not a big smile, not an exaggerated smirk, just the slightest curve of her lips, enough to send a ripple of something unfamiliar down his spine. That was when he realized he hadn't miscalculated. He had made a mistake. A big one, and he was about to find out just how bad it was. The stale, suffocating air of the warehouse clung to Carson's skin as he rolled his shoulders, adjusting to the familiar sense of control that always settled over him in moments like this. The flickering light overhead cast uneven shadows against the damp concrete, the metal chair in the center of the room standing out like an execution post, the woman bound to it still maintaining that same irritating, infuriating composure. He had dealt with every kind of person in this chair before, those who broke instantly, who begged the moment the tape touched their skin, those who held out, who screamed, cursed, and spat before finally shattering beneath the weight of inevitability. But this woman was different, and he hated that he could feel it before she had even spoken a word. It wasn't just that she hadn't begged, hadn't pleaded for her life, hadn't even reacted the way people were supposed to in situations like this. It was the look in her eyes, the unwavering, razor-sharp control that was so absolute it was beginning to burrow into his mind like a splinter. Carson clenched his jaw, refusing to let that thought fester. He had done this before, many times, and he knew exactly how this played out. People could act tough, could put on a front, but the body never lied. It was only a matter of time before the facade cracked, before the real fear bled through the surface and left them shaking, vulnerable, waiting for mercy that would never come. He had learned early on that all people, no matter how hardened, no matter how trained, had a breaking point. He was an expert at finding it. The radio on the rusted metal table crackled suddenly, static hissing before a muffled voice filtered through the speaker, some dispatcher relaying an incident somewhere across the city, something irrelevant, something that reminded Carson that out there, beyond these walls, the world continued on as usual, blissfully unaware of what was happening in this place, in this moment. He exhaled, long and slow, flexing his fingers before dragging a hand down his face, shaking his head as if to clear whatever it was that had been gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He wouldn't let her get to him. Not like this. He had the advantage, the upper hand. She was tied to a chair, completely at his mercy. She could play her mind games all she wanted, but at the end of the day, there was only one truth that mattered. He was the one with the power here, not her. The baton in his hand felt solid, comforting, an extension of his will, and as he turned toward her again, he let the weight of it tap lightly against his palm, a subtle reminder of what came next. He stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately, watching for the first sign of real fear, that slight flicker in the eyes, the tensing of the shoulders, the quickening of breath that always came right before the moment of surrender. But there was nothing. Just that same steady, maddening calm that was beginning to dig under his skin like rusted barbed wire. "You know," he murmured, letting the baton trail along the metal armrest of the chair, the sound a soft scrape against the silence. "Most people in your position at least try to talk their way out of this. Make excuses, beg, cry." He leaned in slightly, tilting his head, narrowing his eyes. "But you're not like most people, are you?" She blinked, just once, then exhaled through her nose, her lips pressing together as though she were contemplating whether or not his question was even worth answering. Carson clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around the handle of the baton. "I've seen people like you before," he continued, stepping around her chair, slow, predatory. "The ones who think they can handle anything. The ones who think they've got everything figured out." He let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "But do you know what happens to people like that?" He stopped, standing directly behind her now, lowering his voice to a near whisper as he leaned in close. "They learn the hard way that they were wrong." Still nothing. Not a single sign of fear. Not even the smallest shift in her posture. He inhaled sharply, exhaling through his teeth, the sound carrying more irritation than he intended to reveal. The baton came down hard against the side of the chair, a sharp, metallic clang that echoed through the empty warehouse like a gunshot. But she didn't even flinch. Carson's teeth ground together, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He had broken grown men with far less. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Grabbing the back of her head roughly, he wrenched her face upward, his fingers tangling in her hair, yanking hard enough that she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "I asked you a question," he growled, his thumb pressing against the pulse point beneath her jaw. "You're not special. You're not different. You're not different. You're just another arrogant little bitch who... You're wasting your time." The words came so smoothly, so evenly, that it took him half a second to even register that she had spoken. He stared at her, his grip tightening, his pulse jumping just slightly at the sound of her voice, because there was no fear in it. No strain. No sign of a woman who understood the situation she was in. "You think this is control," she continued, her voice quiet but firm, her head tilting just slightly against the pressure of his grip. "You think you've won just because you got me in this chair." Carson's fingers twitched. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head, her expression shifting, something flickering behind her eyes that made his gut twist in a way he didn't like. "No," she said, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. "You don't even realize what you've done." The words settled between them, heavy, unnerving, and for the first time in his life, Carson felt something unexpected crawl up his spine. The lights flickered. The radio crackled again, the sound distant, warped. Carson's pulse was steady, his breath controlled, but something in the pit of his stomach had begun to curdle, something that felt dangerously close to unease. "What the hell are you talking about?" he muttered. But there was something different in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. The chair creaked. And then, in one fluid motion, her shoulders rolled, her wrists flexed, and the duct tape snapped. Carson took a step back, his breath catching for just a split second, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Impossible. He had done this before. He had tied those restraints himself. There was no way. The lights flickered again, casting shadows across her face as she stretched her fingers, rolling her neck with a slow, deliberate ease. And then she stood. Not stumbled. Not strained. She stood. Smooth. Unbothered. Like she had been waiting for this exact moment. And in that instant, Carson knew. He had made a mistake. The moment Carson saw her stand, his entire body went rigid, his breath caught in his throat as something cold and electric shot down his spine. It was the way she moved, not with the frantic, erratic desperation of someone making a last-ditch escape attempt, not with the sluggish, clumsy limbs of someone who had spent too long tied down. No, she moved like she had been waiting, like she had known this moment would come and had been conserving her energy, keeping herself still, watching, measuring him, biding her time until the exact second when she could make her move. And now, she had. His grip on the baton tightened instinctively as his mind struggled to recalibrate, struggled to grasp how the hell she had gotten out of restraints that he had secured himself. The same way he always did, the same method that had worked without fail on every single person before her. There had been no signs of struggle, no subtle shifting, no warning, just the eerie, seamless transition from sitting still to standing tall. And now she was looking at him with a gaze that sent a bolt of something primal through his chest. Not fear, no, not yet. But something dangerously close to it. The overhead light flickered again, the shadows in the warehouse growing longer, and in that split second where darkness overtook the room, Carson took a step back. He caught himself as soon as he did it, rage boiling over inside of him at his own body's betrayal. He was the one in control here. He was the one who dictated how this went, not her, not some smug bitch who thought she could shake him just because she knew a few tricks. He had handled bigger, meaner, more dangerous people than her, and he had put every single one of them on their knees. This would be no different. He forced himself to sneer, forced himself to push past that initial jolt of unease, tightening his stance as he swung the baton up slightly, the motion meant to reassert dominance, to remind her that, despite whatever delusions she might have about turning the tables, she was still in a goddamn warehouse with a cop who had every intention of making sure she left it in pieces. "Sit your ass back down," he ordered, voice rough, steady, the kind of voice that made most people hesitate, made most people instinctively obey without thinking. But she didn't. Bitch, she didn't. She tilted her head slightly, stretching her arms, rolling her shoulders like she was shaking off a mild inconvenience rather than standing in front of a man armed with a baton. And that was when he realized that she wasn't just some woman who had gotten lucky with a loose piece of duct tape. No, there was something else, something beneath the surface, something he should have seen before, something he was just now starting to understand, far too late. He barely had a second to react before she moved. One moment she was standing there, calm, patient, unreadable, and the next she was closing the distance between them with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, that no one should have been capable of after sitting tied to a chair for that long. His body responded on instinct, swinging the baton toward her ribs, putting his weight into it, expecting the familiar, satisfying impact of flesh and bone giving way beneath him. But it never came. At the last second, she pivoted, her body twisting with inhuman precision as she avoided the strike, and before he could adjust, before he could raise the baton again, she was already inside his guard. He felt the sharp, precise impact of her elbow slamming into his forearm, felt the shockwave of pain radiate up his arm as his grip faltered for just a moment, just enough time for her to twist her body again, grabbing his wrist and pulling him forward with terrifying ease. His balance shifted, weight thrown off as his own momentum betrayed him, and then her knee was driving up into his gut, forcing the air from his lungs in a single, vicious exhale. He stumbled back, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, and then, for the first time since this had started, he understood something that he never should have let himself realize. She was better than him. She. He had spent his career relying on brute force, on intimidation, on the fact that most people didn't know how to fight back, on the fact that even if they did, he was stronger, faster, more prepared. He had never once considered what it would be like to come up against someone who wasn't just ready for him, but had been trained for far worse. Panic flared in his chest as he scrambled to regain his footing, barely dodging the next strike aimed at his throat, barely lifting the baton in time to block a hit that would have shattered his nose. She was relentless, precise, not wasting a single movement, not throwing a single punch that wasn't meant to incapacitate him in the most efficient way possible. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't a desperate attempt to get away. This was an execution. His back slammed into the metal table, the contents clattering to the floor as he struggled to catch his breath, to force air back into his lungs. But she didn't give him the chance. Before he could even think about retaliating, her fingers wrapped around his wrist, twisting with a force that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm, and then his baton was gone, ripped from his grasp and tossed across the room like it was nothing. That was when the fear hit him. Real, tangible fear. The kind that settled deep in his gut. The kind that he had spent years putting into other people. The kind that made his hands shake as he tried to reach for the gun at his hip, knowing that if he didn't get it out now, he wouldn't get another chance. But she was faster. Bum. Her foot came down on his knee with a sickening crunch, and suddenly he was falling, legs buckling beneath him as pain shot up through his body like wildfire, his balance gone, his control gone, his power slipping through his fingers faster than he could comprehend. She crouched down in front of him, watching, studying, waiting as he gasped for air, as his vision blurred at the edges from the pain radiating from his shattered knee, as his mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. "You talk too much," she murmured, tilting her head as she reached forward, wrapping her fingers around his throat, squeezing just enough to remind him of what was happening, of who was in charge now, of how badly he had underestimated her. His hands clawed at hers, useless, weak, pathetic. "Do you feel it now?" she asked, voice still calm, still controlled, still lacking any of the panic he had so desperately wanted to see in her eyes. He tried to speak, tried to respond, but all that came out was a choked, broken sound. Her grip tightened. "Do you finally understand?" she continued, leaning in just slightly, close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath against his face. "What it feels like when the person in control decides you don't get to walk away." The words hit harder than any of her strikes had, because he did. Dead. For the first time in his life, he understood exactly what that felt like. The air in the warehouse was thick, heavy with the scent of blood, sweat, and the rusted metal of old, forgotten equipment. Carson lay on his back, his vision blurring at the edges, his body refusing to respond the way he needed it to. His knee was shattered, the pain radiating in nauseating waves through his entire leg, making it impossible to stand, impossible to fight back, impossible to do anything except lie there, sucking in ragged breaths and trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. He had never lost before. Never. He had spent years honing his instincts, learning how to dominate, how to break people, how to make sure that no matter what, he was the one who walked away standing. And now he was the one sprawled across the cold concrete, staring up at the flickering light above him while this woman, this goddamn woman stood over him with the calm, unwavering presence of a predator who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. His fingers twitched against the floor as he forced himself to breathe through the pain, to push past the panic creeping up his throat like bile. He wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to just let this happen. Not to him. He had gotten out of worse situations before, had clawed his way back from things that should have put him in the ground, and this wasn't going to be any different. He just needed to get his gun, needed to get his fingers around the grip, needed to aim. But before his arm could move, before he could even shift toward his holster, she stepped down hard on his wrist, the sudden, crushing pressure sending another wave of pain screaming up his arm. He bit down on his tongue to keep from making a sound, to keep from giving her the satisfaction of hearing him break, but she knew. She could feel the way his body reacted, the involuntary twitch of his muscles, the way his breath hitched just slightly in his throat. She had been studying him from the moment he took her, and now she knew exactly how to dismantle him piece by piece. Lorraine crouched down beside him, her fingers pressing lightly against the pulse in his neck, feeling the frantic beat of his heart hammering against her touch. He was afraid. He was trying to hide it, trying to mask it behind clenched teeth and anger, but it was there, thrumming beneath his skin like a war drum. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, her expression unreadable. "I know what you're thinking," she murmured, her voice as calm as ever, as if they were having an entirely different kind of conversation. "You think you still have a chance. You think if you just wait for the right moment, if you play it smart, you can turn this around." She leaned in closer, so close that her lips nearly brushed against his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "But you won't. You won't, because I'm not giving you that moment." He snarled, jerking his arm in an attempt to break free, but her knee pressed down harder against his chest, pinning him in place. He wasn't weak. He had taken down men twice her size, had crushed them beneath his strength, had made them beg for mercy, but this was different. She wasn't just strong, she was trained, calculated, a machine built for destruction, and she was looking at him the way a soldier looks at an enemy who has already lost the war. His breathing turned shallow as he forced himself to think, forced himself to find a way out, but every option led to the same inevitable conclusion. She had him. He had underestimated her from the very beginning, and now he was paying for it in the worst possible way. "You don't want to do this," he ground out, his voice rough, hoarse. "You kill a cop, they'll hunt you down. You think you'll get away with it?" Lauren blinked, her lips twitching slightly, almost like she was amused. "Who said anything about killing you?" She reached down, her fingers pressing against the tendons in his wrist, applying just enough pressure to make his hand spasm, to make him lose whatever remaining grip he had on control. That would be too easy. Carson's pulse spiked, a fresh wave of adrenaline shooting through him, making his thoughts race, even as his body refused to move the way he wanted it to. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't trying to scare him. That was what made this worse. She was completely in control, completely sure of every move she made, and nothing he could say was going to change that. Lauren let her hand trail up his arm, her nails dragging lightly against his skin before she gripped his shoulder, fingers pressing down hard against the joint. "Do you know what happens when someone applies just the right amount of pressure to the brachial plexus?" She asked conversationally, tilting her head again. "The pain is unbearable, instant, paralyzing." And then she pressed. A bolt of white-hot agony exploded through Carson's arm, his entire body locking up as his nerves lit up like fire. The pain so sudden and so intense that his vision momentarily blacked out. He choked, his body instinctively trying to jerk away, but she held him there, her grip unrelenting, the pressure increasing just slightly until he thought his body might rip itself apart from the inside out. He had felt pain before, had taken hits, had been cut, bruised, broken, but nothing compared to this. This was precision pain, the kind that wasn't just about breaking the body but about breaking the mind along with it. His throat burned as he forced himself to focus, forced himself to breathe through it, but she wasn't stopping. She was waiting, watching, seeing exactly how much he could take. And then, just as suddenly as she had started, she released him. His body sagged against the floor, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven gasps as he fought to regain control of himself. His arm was useless, numb from the shoulder down, and for the first time in his life real, Unfiltered terror shot through his bloodstream. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't just a fight gone wrong. This was something else, something much, much worse. Lauren sat back slightly, her expression still calm, still composed. That was just a taste, she murmured, her gaze flicking over him like she was assessing damage, like she was deciding what to do next. But you understand now, don't you? She leaned in again, her lips inches from his. You understand what it's like to be helpless. Carson's teeth clenched, his jaw locking, his entire body burning with humiliation, with rage, with the overwhelming, suffocating reality that he was no longer in control. He had spent years inflicting this kind of pain on others, making them feel powerless, making them know what it was like to have no say in what happened to them. And now, for the first time, he was on the receiving end, and it was unbearable. Lauren exhaled slowly, rising to her feet, towering over him, the light casting her shadow across his broken body. I could end this right now, she said, almost casually. I could make sure you never get back up again. She crouched back down, tilting her head. But that would be too kind, wouldn't it? Carson swallowed hard, his throat dry, his breath unsteady. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to make her pay for this. But deep down, beneath the anger, beneath the pain, beneath the part of him that still clung desperately to the illusion of control, he knew the truth. She had already won. And she wasn't done yet. The warehouse air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the suffocating weight of humiliation as Carson lay sprawled across the cold concrete floor, his chest heaving with labored breaths, his body barely responding to the commands his mind screamed at it to obey. The throbbing pain in his knee pulsed in waves, sharp and searing, a brutal reminder that he wasn't getting back up on his feet anytime soon. His right arm was still numb from the nerve pressure she had applied, and the sickening realization that he was no longer in control gnawed at him like rust eating through steel. He had thought he was the apex predator, the one who dictated how this night would unfold. But the moment she had snapped her restraints and stood with that eerie, methodical grace, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Lauren was circling him now, her steps slow and deliberate, her boots echoing against the concrete as if savoring the moment, giving him just enough time to absorb the reality of his situation before delivering the next calculated blow. He had dealt with people who fought back before desperate, flailing, untrained fools who swung wildly, hoping to land a lucky hit before inevitably succumbing to exhaustion and fear. But this was different. She hadn't just turned the tables on him. She had planned this. Every movement she made was precise, designed not just to incapacitate him, but to strip him of everything: the control, the dominance, the power he had spent his entire life wielding over others. "You're being quiet," she murmured, pausing just a few feet away from him, tilting her head as if studying a specimen under a microscope. "That's new." Carson gritted his teeth, his pulse hammering in his ears as he forced his breathing to steady. She was trying to get inside his head, and he couldn't let that happen. He had spent years perfecting the art of breaking people, and he knew the tricks. He knew how fear worked, how the mind played against itself in moments like this. If he gave in, if he let her see that flicker of doubt, of weakness, then it was over. He swallowed, the bile rising in his throat, forcing a smirk onto his lips despite the pain. "Enjoy it while you can," he rasped, voice rough but still laced with venom. "Because when this is over, I'm going to put you in the fucking ground." Lauren let out a quiet breath, almost like a laugh. But it wasn't amusement, it was something darker, something Carson couldn't quite place, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. She took another step forward, then crouched beside him, one arm resting casually on her knee as she looked down at him like he was something broken, something beneath her. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice low even, carrying no urgency, No aggression, just certainty. You think this is about me proving something to you, that I need to fight for dominance. She leaned in slightly, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw before gripping it just hard enough to force him to meet her eyes. I already won, Carson. I won the moment you brought me here. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightening beneath her grip, but the way she said it, with such calm finality, made his stomach twist. She released him, standing back up, and in one fluid motion, she reached down and grabbed his gun from his holster before he could even register the movement. He barely had time to react before she ejected the magazine, pulled back the slide, and let the single round in the chamber clatter to the floor. With an almost lazy flick of her wrist, she tossed the empty weapon across the warehouse, the sound of it skidding against the concrete punctuating the absolute futility of his situation. His heartbeat stuttered. That was his last card. His last chance, and now it was gone. Panic started creeping into the edges of his mind, slithering through the cracks he had tried to seal shut, whispering the truth he didn't want to acknowledge he wasn't getting out of this. Lauren exhaled, rolling her shoulders as if loosening the tension in her muscles. You know, I've spent years studying men like you, she said, pacing again, her hands loose at her sides, her movements fluid, controlled. The way you operate, the way you think. You believe strength comes from the ability to take control, to dominate, to make people afraid of you. She stopped suddenly, pivoting toward him, her eyes sharp and unyielding. But real strength, Carson, real power. That comes from knowing exactly when to let someone think they've won. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer to the ribs. She had been in control this entire time. Every second, every movement, every decision, she had played him like a puppet on a string, leading him to this exact moment. And he had walked right into it. His breathing grew shallow, his hands twitching against the floor as he tried to push himself up, to do something, but the pain was overwhelming, his limbs refusing to cooperate. He had never felt this kind of helplessness before, had never known what it was like to be on the other side of the equation, and it was suffocating. Lauren crouched in front of him again, closer this time, her fingers pressing lightly against his shattered knee, the faintest bit of pressure sending fresh agony ripping through his nerves. He let out a strangled sound before he could stop himself, his teeth grinding together so hard he thought they might crack. There it is, she murmured, watching his face carefully. That moment when you realize there's no way out. He sucked in a breath, his pride warring with the instinctual terror clawing at his throat. He wanted to spit in her face, to tell her to go to hell, to fight, but he couldn't. Not like this, not with his body failing him. She leaned in, just a little, her voice dropping lower. But don't worry, she continued, her fingers pressing just a little harder against his knee, making his vision swim. I'm not going to kill you. He wanted to believe that should make him feel better. It didn't. It didn't. Because the way she said it, the weight behind those words, made it clear that whatever she had planned next was going to be worse. She dragged her fingers along his leg, down to his ankle, then up again, slow, methodical, like she was choosing. And then, with zero hesitation, she gripped his broken knee and twisted. The scream that tore from his throat wasn't human. Pain, unlike anything he had ever felt, detonated through his body, his spine arching, his hands clawing at the floor as he gasped for air, as his vision blurred at the edges, as the raw, unbearable agony swallowed him whole, and she just watched, studied him. Cow memorized every reaction. Now, she murmured, tilting her head. Now you understand. His body trembled, sweat slicking his skin, every breath a struggle. He could feel himself slipping, the pain drowning out everything else, his mind barely able to comprehend what was happening anymore. She exhaled, standing up, dusting off her hands like she had just finished fixing something instead of breaking him beyond repair. "This isn't about you, Carson," she said finally, turning toward the exit, her voice almost distant. "You're just a message." And then she was gone, leaving him there, broken, helpless, and completely alone. The pain was unbearable. It didn't just radiate through his body, it consumed him, hollowed him out from the inside, reducing every thought, every breath, every lingering shred of pride to a singular, agonizing truth: he was broken. Carson lay on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, sweat slicking his skin, his body convulsing in weak, sporadic tremors as his mind fought against the onslaught of agony flooding every nerve. His knee was obliterated, a mangled mess of cartilage and shattered bone, twisted beyond recognition by the merciless hands of a woman he had so arrogantly believed would be his victim. His right arm, still half numb from where she had crushed the nerve, refused to obey him, the dead weight of his limb making even the thought of reaching for his baton or his gun, wherever the hell it was, laughable. The very foundations of his existence, the certainty that he was stronger, faster, more dominant than anyone he put his hands on, had been stripped away, leaving him raw, humiliated, and powerless. The silence in the warehouse stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged, uneven sounds of his own breathing. He tried to move, to drag himself toward the exit, to get somewhere, anywhere, but his shattered knee sent a fresh wave of agony ripping through his body, reducing his efforts to little more than a pathetic, twitching crawl. He clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached, swallowing back the groan of pain that threatened to escape his throat. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He wouldn't. But she wasn't even looking at him anymore. Lauren stood near the entrance, back turned to him, hands resting on her hips, breathing slow and steady, as if she were simply taking a moment to collect her thoughts before moving on to the next task on her list. She wasn't lingering for revenge. She wasn't savoring his suffering. She was done with him. That realization burned worse than the pain. Carson had spent his entire career turning men into examples. He had broken them, humiliated them, reminded them who held the power. He had made sure they never forgot what he was capable of, made sure they feared him long after they left his presence. And now, she was doing the same to him. She wasn't going to kill him. She wanted him to live with this, with the memory of what she had done, with the knowledge that he had been beaten, that he had been prey. He couldn't let that happen. He had to do something. His gaze darted across the warehouse, searching, desperate, his pulse hammering against his skull as he tried to find a way out. The gun, he had to get the goddamn gun. She had tossed it aside, thrown the magazine across the floor, but the round that had been chambered, it was still somewhere. If he could just. His left hand clawed at the concrete, dragging his limp, useless body forward inch by agonizing inch. He had never felt this weak, this vulnerable, this insignificant. Every movement was torture, every breath a struggle, but the alternative was worse. If he let her walk away, if he let her leave him like this, he'd never come back from it. He had to end this. But then, before he could reach it, before he could close his fingers around the grip, she spoke. "I wouldn't." Her voice was calm, not angry, not mocking, just certain. Like she had already accounted for this, already predicted every desperate, pitiful attempt he would make to reclaim control of a situation that had spiraled so far beyond his reach. Carson froze. Her footsteps echoed as she turned, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, the sound of her boots against the concrete sending sharp spikes of anxiety through his gut. His fingers twitched. He could still go for it. He could. She crouched in front of him, and before he could react, before he could even think, she grabbed his hand, twisting his fingers back so sharply that pain exploded up his wrist. Another sharp, agonizing crack splitting through the air. Carson howled. Lauren watched. "You still don't get it, do you?" she murmured, her voice too even, too calm, too controlled. She adjusted her grip on his wrist, pressing her thumb into the shattered bone, just enough to send another sickening wave of pain surging through his body, leaving him shaking, breathless, on the verge of unconsciousness. "You don't win this," she continued. "Not this time. Not ever again." He gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body trembling as he fought against the tears burning at the edges of his vision, refusing to break down in front of her. Lauren leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. "You're going to spend the rest of your life remembering this moment," she murmured. "Every time you move, every time you take a step, every time you reach for something with that hand, you'll remember." Her grip tightened, her nails digging into his skin. "You'll remember that for once in your life you were the one who couldn't fight back." Carson's breath hitched. She was right. He'd never forget this. He was never going to be the same. Lauren pulled back, exhaling slowly before releasing him, letting his shattered body slump against the floor in a heap of raw, broken failure. She stood, dusting off her hands, shaking off the last remnants of whatever part of him had once been a threat. Then she turned, walking toward the exit without looking back. Carson's breath stuttered. This was it. She was leaving. And he was. Something inside him snapped. The humiliation, the rage, the unbearable, suffocating certainty that this was the end of him, he couldn't let it happen. With every last ounce of strength he had, he lunged. It was sloppy, desperate, an instinctual act of sheer hatred. And it failed. Before he even made it halfway, she turned. Her boot slammed into his face with bone-crunching force, sending him back hard, his skull cracking against the concrete with a sickening thud. Darkness swallowed him whole. And the last thing he heard before the world faded completely was her voice, soft, almost disappointed. Pathetic. The world returned in slow, agonizing fragments. Carson's head throbbed in waves of searing pain, the deep ache in his skull radiating down his spine like molten lead. His body refused to move, each limb feeling disconnected, like dead weight strapped to a consciousness that was barely clinging to lucidity. His mouth was dry, his throat raw, every breath a sharp reminder of how much damage had been inflicted upon him. The air was still thick with the scent of his own blood, sweat, and the cold, unyielding dampness of the warehouse floor. He blinked, his vision swimming, the dim, flickering overhead light casting long shadows that danced at the edges of his mind. He tried to shift, to push himself up, but the effort sent a shockwave of agony through his shattered knee, pinning him back down. His body was ruined. She had ruined him. A sound of dull, rhythmic tapping cut through the haze in his mind. It took a second for him to process that it was footsteps. Steady. Unrushed. She was still here. Carson's stomach twisted. He wanted to lift his head, to see where she was, but his body refused to obey. The sound of her movement stopped. He swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. He didn't want her to know he was awake. Not yet. Not while he was still vulnerable. "I know you're conscious." Carson, her voice was even, composed, completely detached. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no cruelty, just cold, neutral observation. That made it worse. If she had been gloating, taunting him, at least then he could have clung to something, could have fueled himself with rage, with hatred. But the fact that she was done with him, that she had already moved past him, while he lay here broken, that made the humiliation so much worse. He forced himself to inhale slowly through his nose, ignoring the copper tang of blood on his lips. He needed to think, needed to understand how this was going to end. Lauren's boots scraped slightly against the concrete as she crouched down beside him, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her presence. He tensed involuntarily, a pathetic reflex from a body that could no longer defend itself. "You've always been a coward," she murmured, tilting her head slightly as she watched him struggle to process her words. "You pretended it was strength. You thought violence made you untouchable. But the truth is, you only ever won because you made sure your victims never got a chance to fight back." Carson's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched against the floor. He wanted to deny it, to spit in her face, to curse her name, but his throat felt like sandpaper, and the weight of what she was saying pressed down on him with suffocating force. She sighed, shifting slightly. "I should kill you." Her voice was soft, matter-of-fact. "It would be easy. You'd never be able to stop me." A shudder rolled through him. "But I won't." His breath hitched. Because somehow, that scared him more. Lauren stood, stepping away from him, exhaling as if releasing the last remaining bit of tension from her body. "You're not worth the bullet," she said simply. "You're not even worth the time it would take to watch you bleed out." Carson squeezed his eyes shut, his teeth grinding together as a fresh wave of nausea twisted through his gut. He had never felt so insignificant. "I want you to live," she continued, her voice drifting closer to the entrance. "I want you to wake up every morning knowing that you lost, that you weren't strong enough, that you were nothing." His breath came out uneven, his fingers curling into weak, useless fists against the floor. "You'll never walk right again. You'll never hold a gun steady. You'll never be the man you thought you were." She stopped near the door, turning back toward him. "And the best part, no one is coming to save you." The finality in her voice crushed him. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could still give him a way out. His reputation, his connections, someone would come looking for him. Someone would find him like this, and then his stomach dropped. Because he realized what she had been doing from the moment she stood up. This wasn't just about beating him. This wasn't just about making him suffer. She had erased him. The radio was gone. His phone. His badge. Anything that could tie him back to law enforcement, to the outside world, to his life gone. The warehouse was just another forgotten place in a city that didn't care. No cameras, no witnesses, no one knew where he was. No one was coming. Lauren was already at the door, standing in the threshold, bathed in the faint, hazy glow of the streetlight filtering in from the outside. She glanced back at him one last time, and in her eyes there was no malice, no anger, no hate, just pity. "Good luck, officer," she murmured. "Try not to die too quickly." And then she was gone. The door creaked shut behind her, and Carson lay there in the cold, in the dark, in the absolute nothingness of what was left of him.